You are, so just for those watching this who may not know, Salley Vickers, esteemed, wonderful novelist, whose name is in fact Salley. I almost hesitate to that because I almost broke into singing down by the Salley Gardens. I pulled out my copies of novels of yours I have, and I discovered, I think, your favorite of your short stories.
My favorite of my stories is The Indian Child, which concerns the little changeling boy
Oh,
who
oh right.
appears in Midsummer Night's Dream. It's
That's a bit.
perhaps relevant to our possible conversation.
Yes, because I plan to talk about fairies. Might as
Exactly.
well give away the plot now. I mean,
Yes, I have found over the years in Miss Garnet's Angel, which was my first novel, and I was very lucky to get it, a very receptive public. The Archangel Raphael, who appears out of the story of Tobias and the Angel, which protagonist first sees in one of Venice's beautiful churches, Raphael appears quite conspicuously throughout the narrative. The element that perhaps is, we might say, is occupied by the Archangel Raphael in Miss Garnet's Angel is less obviously discernible. And in this particular book, I wanted to write about a part of England which has a long and ancient history. Well, I suppose all parts of England do, as indeed all parts of the world do, but retains that ancient history in forms of ancient springs, ancient wells, ancient monuments, and ancient holy places. Where it turns out that before the Christians arrived and changed our culture for a long time, there was a very powerful and lively pagan worship. And it's a part of the world, it's the Welsh Marches, the borderland between England and Wales, where I've lived, so I know it well. I never write about a place with which I'm not intimately familiar. I mean, I regard that as the most important thing. If you're going to write about the metaphysical, I think you have to get the physical
yeah.
as accurate and as established as you possibly can. Otherwise, people are simply not going to believe you. They probably won't anyway. But I became very interested in these pagan places that were taken over, in fact, by the early Christian saints after the Romans left and a different way of life became established. And I think that, and my long years of teaching Shakespeare, and my love of Midsummer Night's Dream, and my love of Spenser's The Faerie Queene, and my love of Puck of Pook's Hill by Kipling, reactivated my latent and dormant, but never eradicated interest in fairies or the hidden people or the other people, or however you want to talk about them. And so I introduced them into this novel. But what was so interesting is that although they are really the heart of the novel, where something occurs, which is, it's not taken from any actual fairy tale, but it's in the provenance of fairy telling, where something happens in a wild place that has a life-changing effect.
Well, it's sort of the axis of the narrative,
It is.
which is why I find it strange that someone could fail to notice what's
Well,
going
the
on
thing
there.
is, I don't actually spell it out, you see.
Yes.
And this, of course, is the great problem, because if you spell things out, your percipient reader, such as yourself, and the kind of reader I really want to have, says, why the hell is she spelling it out? Does she think I'm stupid? If you don't spell it out, people don't see it. So I have had a number of people writing in on Amazon saying, lovely book, interesting book about nature and England and two sisters who don't get on and then do get on. But what the hell's happening in the middle of the book? Why has it got this funny ending? And of course, the ending is a magical ending. But I leave it to the reader and the reader's imagination to create the story of what happened, because I don't exactly know what happened in
Right,
just
right. Well,
at the end of Garnet's Angel. Sorry, I
I'm
don't quite
sorry that
know what
we're
happened.
getting the delay, the transatlantic
Yeah,
delay. Sorry,
yeah.
I'll shut up for a
Okay.
second. Let you finish.
I was just saying, at the end of Miss Garnet's Angel, Miss Garnet walks across a bridge to somewhere,
Yeah.
and it isn't clear where she's going and what's happening to her. And I've left that to the readers to make out for themselves. I do the same thing in The Gardener, because I think you should trust your readers.
Yeah.
But it's because I feel, and I know we agree about this, but it's probably worth us spelling it out, that the imagination of both the writer and the reader acts upon whatever we call reality and is itself creative. So the reader is creating an imaginal world out of my book as he or she is reading it. And that doesn't always happen, because I think we are unused to exercising our imagination upon the world in the ways that we used to do before the so-called Enlightenment, she said, introducing a rather large topic.
Of course, I love the very formulation that the reader creates an imaginal world in the act of reading. This is a curious aspect about the entire modern approach, well, maybe the modern approach to everything, you know, sort of positivistic approach to experience, but to literature and the arts, is the notion that one's encountering a fixed artifact whose principal interest is that it's authentic, that is, that it comes from this particular artist, and whose content is an act on the part of that artist simply to communicate things in a propositional way. Whereas we, at least judging from the philosophical and religious commentaries on the literature of the antique past, of the ancient world, no one thought of reading that way.
No.
The act of reading itself was an inspired process. Interpretation was part of the creative act, and it's a curious. I mean, obviously, this comes up in theological history, and you know, the transition, that dreadful moment that we call the Enlightenment. But rather the transition from ancient and medieval habits of reading to modernity, this habit of treating, say, the Bible, obviously the Bible, as a text containing either immutable oracles delivered from the lips of God, or propositional content that you either affirm or reject. But up until that threshold was crossed, the act of reading was always understood as something that almost of necessity, if the text was worth your time, that is, required reading per allegoriam, required reading it as also the occasion of a creative act on the part of the reader. And so, yes, no, I mean, I appreciate, I would have hated it if you had spelled out exactly what happened that night. That's all I'll say for those who haven't read the book. I would have hated that. You're right. As it was, there's a wonderful, there's not only a wonderful air of mystery about that scene, that, you know, it's something, I'll just say that something that's sort of between waking and dreamlike consciousness, the way it's described, very beautifully described. But at the end, you're left with a mystery. On the one hand, there's a perfectly natural explanation, but on the other hand, there's a surfeit beyond the natural that clings to the, and you're just left with it. And I think that's, well, anyway, I found the book captivating, and also because you told me that you stole a line from me. I did. To throw in an advertisement for myself.
I did, and the trouble is, you know, David, I don't have a copy of my own book here, but perhaps you do, and you will know the line. I give it to Miss Foote.
Well, the problem is I don't. I remember when you told me where it came from, but it was from...
Well, it's a line that from a conversation you had with your son, and it's in one of your books of essays, and it's a moment when he looks at a beautiful autumnal wood and says, you can see why in the ancient days people used to think there were dryads and sprites in the wood, and you're horrified. And you say, what makes you think that there are no dryads and sprites in the wood? you say something which, unfortunately, although I've stolen it from you, and given it and delivered it into the mouth of Miss Foote, who I probably speaks for both
It's
of us.
it's always I've got to make a
It's the
joke here about
effect.
foot and mouth and foot. Anyway, so here we go.
Sorry, yes. Um, the essence, although can't quote you or her word for word, is that the sprites and spirits existed in the wood long before the Christians came, but they haven't gone. They're just hiding. And I think it's that liminal world of the world that exists between the human being and the natural world is, I think, the world that throughout history up until very recently, and recently in the works of the rather crude works of Walt Disney, is occupied by these presences that operate between, well, I think they have an ontological reality. So it's a question of discerning other levels of reality than the quotidian material reality that is what we seem nowadays to be stuck with, to our great loss, a diminished world. And it was, I stole your line quite openly. I mean, I didn't even imagine I'd made it up for myself, because it so exactly represented what I wanted Miss Foote to say. And you said it for her better than I did. But I did own up.
Okay, so but I think I've come up with the joke. It's something about having put Miss Foot in my mouth or something. But I'm still working on it. But anyway, I'm very flattered. But it's also true that I share your conviction that we're talking about a real dimension of existence and experience. In fact, I think, in a sense, classical Christian metaphysics sort of requires a notion of the presence of living consciousness throughout the natural order. Simply, the traditional logos metaphysics of Christian thought is not, too long. And this is part of post-Reformation consciousness, but I can't put all the burden on the Protestants or the counter-reformers. Or there's a sort of disenchantment that robs the world not only of its metaphysical depth, but robs it of the sort of the coherence of believing that this is the manifestation of divine mind, but also that actually makes comprehensible the presence of human consciousness in nature. I'm working now, finishing up a book on the philosophy of mind for Yale, which is very late in being finished for any number of reasons, mostly the COVID shutdown. And I think what's interesting is more and more the philosophy of consciousness at present is moving almost inexorably towards embracing forms of panpsychism. I think in a naive way, in a crude way at times, but because more and more there's a realization that either consciousness is an anomaly within a mechanistic universe, in which case it's inexplicable because the causal narrative between that mechanistic order and what consciousness clearly is cannot be told, cannot even be imagined, and probably cannot actually really exist. Or you're going to have to accept that consciousness itself is intrinsic to the structure of the universe, to the reality of nature. And if that's so, then it may be the fact that a world that perceived or thought in terms of dryads and naiads and nereids, or Kama and Tami, or Manitou is one that's a more rational picture of reality than the sort of barren mechanistic picture of nature we work with now.